This is episode 233 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, another action-packed week here in the public policy realm in New Mexico. But first, it is very important to kind of recognized and, of course, discuss the future of the U.S. Supreme Court with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. No one ever said anything but that she was a nice person. She was also very much of the left. Her friendship with also somewhat recently deceased Justice Scalia was well publicized. So definitely somebody who left a mark in terms of civility on the court. Didn't agree with her much on the issues, but very important decision or very important decisions written, and especially with the election happening, this is going to be yet another major divide in our country.
Yes, no doubt about it. And I tend to agree with you. Whatever the judicial equivalent of a statesman is, that was certainly her. And now, from a policy point of view, we get to see all kinds of fireworks going to happen in Washington. I have a feeling with the Republicans saying that they are going to put up a nomination and hold hearings in the Senate. And the Democrats not very happy about that, all in the middle of an election, in the middle of a pandemic, forest fires, earthquakes, hurricanes. It's the year of a lot of activity and movement. And this one is going to be, I don't know, I think this may go to the top for a few weeks here in terms of the things that the country's paying attention to.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how the political fallout for this whole situation comes, and affects November's results. Of course, Trump has said, and I expect that Trump will put forth a nominee to the court. That nominee will not be confirmed almost with 100% likelihood. They won't be confirmed by election day, but certainly it could be, the process could be going on through close to January, when the new president, or potentially Trump, will be sworn in yet again. And who knows how that whole dynamic will work. Certainly the left is very concerned about abortion and that issue. We could go through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's entire track record and decisions. I'll just say that the one time I was able to go live and in person to the Supreme Court was the Kelo versus New London decision. That was the one that dealt with eminent domain, and it gave governments very, very significant power over taking people's homes and property if they thought they could get a economic benefit of some way, shape, or form. It had to do with development of the Pfizer drug company in New London, Connecticut. That development never came about, so the government didn't get their tax revenues. This is all under the George W. Bush administration, and the Bush administration issued a brief on behalf of the city of New London. They supported it. That decision was 5-4. Ginsburg was on the side of, to use a Bushism, evildoers, people who felt like it's perfectly okay for the government to come along and take your property as long as they think it's going to generate them more tax revenue. I think it was a core function of creating what was the Tea Party at the time. It's something that, interestingly, our current president, Donald Trump, who, while Ginsburg and Trump may not agree on many issues, Trump has used eminent domain, and I would dare say that he misused eminent domain. So it's something that I think is a core decision that delineated those on the court who believed in a limited government and individual property rights, and those who did not. And to her, I think, eternal shame, Ruth Bader Ginsburg believed basically that government should have carte blanche to come in and take your property. And unfortunately, that is I'm not going to sit here and say nasty things about her. She has passed, but I just think that was a atrocious U.S. Supreme Court decision. Not that there haven't been others on either side of the issue, but or aisle, if you will. But I think she's somebody that, from that property rights, basic role of government perspective, Trump could probably do better with his appointee, whoever that may be. Ironically, even though he personally, in his business dealings, dealt with the eminent domain issue and actually kind of benefited from that directly. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just a little more on that eminent domain issue, because it is such an interesting and important one, is that tended to be a unifier of the left and right, that entire issue. And having said that, I would say that Justice Ginsburg probably was going against the broader wishes of the left, and certainly the broader wishes of the right. That's almost the corporatist role of government, as opposed to the, what you say, the administrative or whatever form of government. And that was one where, I don't think that anybody, there's a strong constituency for that one, and a lot of legislation undoing that, by the way. And that's what showed that it was not. And again, in a very divided Congress in the United States, much less across all 57 states, as they like to say. I know there's 50.
Was actually pushed by the Rio Grande Foundation right here in New Mexico. It was one of my first projects when I took the reins here. And interestingly enough, then Governor Bill Richardson named the commission and ultimately signed the legislation, despite him running for president. And it's one of the things about Richardson that I remain befuddled by. That's the kind of thing that is a populist, left and right message, to say we're not going to allow the government to take your land kind of arbitrarily. Richardson did not tout that issue. He did it very quietly. He supported and signed that legislation without any fanfare at the time. That is from 2005. The argument was in February. The decision was handed down by the court in 2005. Again, it was a very deeply divided court with Stevens, Kennedy, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer, and the concurrence, and the dissent, Sandra Day O'Connor, joined by Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas. So I feel very comfortable with where my dissenters are, as they people on the courts and associated with them often wonder where various ideological folks are when it comes down to the court. And speaking of courts, we of course have been tracking, bemoaning, frustrated by, and watching the courts of New Mexico and even federal courts ratify Governor Lujan Grisham's COVID-19 policies, which essentially mean, in practice, do whatever I tell you to do. She has very little in the way of accountability, legal or legislative or anyone else. But a Trump-appointed judge in Pennsylvania threw out that state's lockdown recently, and the opinion is so worth focusing on. First, Trump-appointed judge, really quickly, because, of course, we're talking about replacing a Supreme Court justice, and I think Trump does have a very strong record, while many libertarians and some on the right don't necessarily care for the way he's done certain things, and we share many of those concerns. His judges have been generally on the constitutional right, widely held as supporters of the Constitution. And this gentleman, Stidham or Stickney, I forget his exact name, but he was a Trump-appointed judge out of Pennsylvania. And I'll read his conclusion. The court closes this opinion as it began by recognizing that defendants, that's the state of Pennsylvania and the governor, actions at issue here were undertaken with good intentions of addressing a public health emergency. But even in an emergency, the authority of government is not unfettered. The liberties protected by the Constitution are not fair weather freedoms in place when times are good, but able to be cast aside in times of trouble. There is no question that this country has faced and will face emergencies of every sort, but the solution to a national crisis can never be permitted to supersede the commitment to individual liberty that stands as the foundation of the American experiment. The Constitution cannot accept the concept of a new normal where the basic liberties of the people can be subordinated to open-ended emergency mitigation measures. Rather, the Constitution sets certain lines that may not be crossed, even in an emergency. Actions taken by defendant cross these lines. It is the duty of the court to declare those actions unconstitutional. Thus, consistent with the reasons set forth above, the court will enter judgment in favor of the plaintiffs. And I can't stand up and, yes, thank you. That is absolutely what I want to do every time I read this particular conclusion. It's just the conclusion of this decision. I posted it over at errorsoфenchantment.com and on social media. A lot of folks read it and were also standing and cheering.
Yes. And, I think the whole view of the Constitution is something that really matters and really does control governance in the United States is important. And there's one word that just brings this so in focus in the specific situation, the facts, as it were, because there's the law and there's the facts, and that is open-ended. So how long does an emergency last? So if emergencies can last forever, do our freedoms go away forever? And I think that's really a way that you could summarize that ruling from the Pennsylvania judge.
Yeah. And the man's name, the judge's name is Stickham, Stick H-A-M. So it's worth getting his name right, because whatever other opinions he has handed down in his day, this one certainly resonated with me. And I think folks here in New Mexico who are absolutely just done with the governor and her approach to the COVID-19 situation. It would be great if that was a Supreme Court decision handed down and that it applied everywhere, because unfortunately this is a federal single judge. It'll be appealed likely. And
there'll be another federal judge that will say that there's no limit to what governors can do in many cases. And then
it would be an appeals court.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be a panel of three,
yes.
Or if they do en banc, it gets pretty complicated.
So the bottom line is 5 to 7 years from now, we might know at the Supreme Court at the rate things are going.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems with the court system in this country. Even in the best of circumstances, unless you're Governor Lujan Grisham and you get the opinion down from the court on restaurants like a snap of a finger, as she did earlier on in this crisis, the system takes a while to work itself out, and certainly getting an opinion out of the Supreme Court takes some time. The governor did have another press conference last Thursday, and she opened up slightly in terms of additional activities, youth sports conditioning and skills development with no more than 10 individuals in any one group.
AKA practice.
Yes.
Not games, practice, right?
Competitive contact play remains off limits. New Mexico's can now camp overnight at most parks in groups of no more than 10. Pick your own pumpkin patches are soon to be permitted to operate, which is lovely, except for
Big Pumpkin finally got to her, I guess. Great Pumpkin.
No, Big Pumpkin is still on the sidelines, and I'm only talking about one pumpkin patch, which is McCall's Pumpkin Patch, the Disneyland of pumpkin patches, which I have small children, and they always enjoy heading out, and this would be an especially great year to go to that particular pumpkin patch. McCall's was covered in the news. I think Channel 4 KOB had them talking about the challenges they face, because they have, the hay rides, they have the maze, they have little slides and different other things for people to do and jump around on, the kids to jump around on. Unfortunately, I suspect they are not going to be able to do any of that in 2020. Swimming pools are open just in time for fall, true Governor Lujan Grisham style, and ice skating rinks may operate, but for athletic training and practice by reservation only. You cannot go with your sweetheart whenever the weather does turn cold, or we do have 2 indoor ice rinks here in town, and just skating around in circles with your sweetheart or your friends and family, that is still off limits. So, yeah, a few nice things that are happening, moving in
So
the
we
right
can go
direction.
bowling though, then, right, Paul?
Depends on if you are a member of the military or have a spouse in said position. Yes, I did quite a bit of work on this issue and put a specific blog post up talking about the bowling situation. Right up there with McCall's pumpkin patch with my kids is bowling. And yeah, they have been prohibited by government fiat from bowling. Bowling alleys in New Mexico have not been open since essentially mid-March. Interestingly enough, if you have an ID to get on at Kirtland Air Force Base, White Sands Missile Range, and probably a few other locales, probably out in Clovis and that base, you may be able to get out and bowl. And those facilities are open. I even called them, and they seem to question me, like, what are you even talking about? Of course we're open. But if you try to go to any of the bowling alleys around town, around New Mexico, outside of military installations, or even on native lands, because one of the dynamics here is that your casinos, not all native casinos are open, but I know Isleta and Santa Ana are definitely open, but and because they are tribal lands and they have sovereignty that they can invoke against the governor shutting them down. Now, they did shut down for a while, but they revamped their operations to be COVID compliant. Now, racinos and other casinos under the state are not able to open. But interestingly enough, Santa Ana and Isleta, which both have bowling alleys, as does Route 66 Casino out to the west of town, that one, they are all still closed. Now, I suspect that the tribes are saying, we're going to, in the immortal words of Kenny Rogers, deceased at the beginning of this whole situation, you got to know when to hold them, you got to know when to fold them. And the casinos, the native tribes are saying, we want the money that gambling is, because gambling is literally like printed money. They can, it basically is a guaranteed source of significant amount of money, especially when others are closed. Well, bowling alleys aren't quite that significant of a source of revenue. So they are willing to reopen in somewhat defiance of the governor with regard to the casinos, but not bowling alleys and other things. So if you are my children, or unless you have pretty good connections to one of the military installations around our state, you're still out of luck on the bowling front.
Yes, and that is sad for the bowling alleys, with the exception of Main Event, the ones you talked about. The rest of the bowling alleys that are closed and slowly hemorrhaging cash away to oblivion tend to be privately owned small businesses.
Small businesses, yeah.
And the key to the COVID is the management of of COVID is going quite well. And so for them to be there, I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But as we've talked several times, there's many of these policies that are not done on a broad kind of category point of view. They're very, very specific, and this is one of the examples of that for sure.
Well, what would be really awesome and thoughtful is if the governor approached some of these places, whether it's on base bowling alleys or casinos that have opened, and said, hey, look, I know you're not going to do what I want you to do, but maybe you can engage with us in some contact tracing and help us understand how many people are getting COVID-19 at the casinos, how many people are getting COVID-19 at the bowling alleys. And does this mean that we should alter our approach to these things and that we can do things in a COVID-safe manner, as presumably you're able to do in some of these environments? I don't know what the bowling situation looks like. Are you going every other lane? So you avoid two groups of people using the same ball dispenser and all those kinds of various things. Same with casinos. You have plexiglass in between the slot machines. What does that look like? I haven't been gambling since, been to the casino since the whole COVID situation. I suspect that she is not taking advantage of those opportunities for real world science. And again, it just makes me question the whole thing. Wally, by the time this podcast is published and available to folks online, we will have found out the results of a couple of additional gun rights ordinances or anti-gun rights ordinances at Albuquerque City Council. One deals with storage of your gun, and essentially the city government of Albuquerque attempting to tell you how and where you must store your gun. The other has to do with guns in city buildings and on city properties, and attempting to eliminate that as being possible. They've already done some very significant legal gymnastics to make the plaza and other parks act as educational institutions. And again, the courts will have to decide on a lot of this. But before they get to that, we may hopefully see 5 city councilors, as they did on the constitutional amendment recommendation a week or two ago, stand up and say, we don't want to violate our citizens' gun rights here at the city of Albuquerque.
Yeah, very interesting. There's a lot of hope on this. And this gun storage one in particular is, I was just wondering what bureaucracy would come to do that. So, do all gun holders need to be subject to inspection of their storage facilities? And, it's just, it could get very ridiculous very quickly. But, we've seen a lot of other laws and ordinances in Albuquerque get way out of control in a big hurry as well. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, well, maybe that's something that we ought to really think long and hard about, put the brakes on. And if we don't put the brakes on it, what is it? Is the People's Gun Storage Commission Inspection Council will come to your house and check out your gun storage. Seems like maybe that's a bit too far in a city that still has a very high murder rate, lots of property crime, lots of auto theft. And again, will this make the people who have guns deal with them safely? It's one of those, there's lots of gun laws out there, and the criminals don't seem to mind breaking all the ones that exist today. This would just be one more that they would probably break.
Yeah, and the answer is, to the storage question, the government, unless they go door to door and start checking up on people, which...
We don't want to suggest that in
Yeah.
the Stasi sort of, Secret Service...
Right.
For what do we say? Secret police, I guess
Right.
is the right word. No, we don't want that here in Albuquerque.
Yeah, it's unenforceable. But also in local politics here in the Albuquerque area, Bernalillo County Commission is considering on Tuesday legislation or ordinance to mandate that any public works project that gets so much as $1 from the county of Bernalillo has to use employees who are unionized, not government employees, but laborers, people who work on construction projects, 8% of whom in the state of New Mexico are unionized. This will, if adopted, have a dual effect of increasing the price of public works projects built with county dollars. That could be roads, could be sewer systems, it could be a variety of things. And it will potentially make it more difficult for those 92% of New Mexico tradespeople to find work. They will either have to join the union, or they may be outcompeted by folks coming in from other states who are already in the union and then can take on those roles. We will see, and I'm sure we will discuss next week exactly what happens with the project labor agreement ordinance at the county. Wally, we're going to transition now to an important economic issue facing New Mexico during the COVID-19 situation, which is our elevated unemployment rate. That means The August numbers have come out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics quicker than they often do, with a holiday week in there with Labor Day. Government data can be slowed to a trickle. But the news is not especially great for the land of enchantment in terms of unemployment rate being quite high, significantly higher than our neighbors, but at 11.3%, we are higher than any state in the union besides Nevada. Nevada, we've talked about it before. They are just in a world of hurt, and it's a blue state now, at least in terms of the governor, and the governor there has kept Nevada in very much a lockdown situation. Again, that casino information might be worth having if we know how many people are getting COVID-19 from casinos, whether here in New Mexico or in Nevada. But there's a lot that goes on in Nevada these days besides just casinos, a lot of shows that aren't being shown and performers and whatnot. Rhode Island, New York, Hawaii, California, and New Mexico. So those are your top 6 states in terms of unemployment. Our neighbors are well below where we are. Colorado is the highest neighboring state. Their rate is 6.7%. Actually, Texas is higher at 6.8%. So right there, those 2 states. And then you have Arizona at 5.9, Oklahoma 5.7. And Utah is no longer the best in the country at 4.1%. That honor is now Nebraska's. But we are just far, far behind any of our neighbors when it comes to recovering economically from COVID-19.
Yes, and as New Mexico saw through the Great Recession of the 2008 period, we were a decade recovering from that to get employment numbers back to what they were. It took 10 years, and to be this level of unemployment. And we have not seen the other shoe drop in our state, which is the thing that we talk about a bit, and we'll probably talk about a little bit more later in the show. And that is the oil and gas industry, the one of the largest industries when it comes to employment and certainly payment of funds that fund state and local governments is really down. And so what happens when government has to cut down just a little bit? It's what are we going to see in the state of New Mexico? And then the longer that we go on with small businesses going out of business, I've seen statistics that show that a lot of the restaurants that are not open, if they may never open. So that's one. We've talked about bowling alleys. There's just this whole other aspect of the economy that here in New Mexico is really hurting. And how long will it go on to the point where I won't say it would never be recoverable, but it may be, again, another 10 years, 15 years until things get back, quote unquote, to where they were, where they should be, where they were before all this started.
No doubt about it. And, another challenge we face as a state is electricity. And this transition that our governor and the legislature have embarked us upon as a state, which involves totally dumping all carbon-based electricity forms, not just CO2 releasing, but by 2045, the PRC, Public Regulation Commission, has now said that New Mexico is supposed to be out of nuclear as well, which is a zero carbon form of electricity. It's something that I think is a form of malpractice by policymakers. It's one thing to be carbon free. It's another thing to try to get out of nuclear as well, especially if those nuclear plants are already online and working. I think, as somebody who believes global warming and man-made climate change are problems, but problems that can be dealt with, nuclear needs to be a prominent part of the solution to the whole environmental issue, CO2 emissions, et cetera. But going 100% so-called renewable involves wind, involves solar, and involves batteries, at least so far as we are seeing here in New Mexico. Nuclear is not part of the mix. And Between June 2019 and June 2020, according to a new report from SaveOnEnergy.com, New Mexico saw a 10.1% increase in its electricity rates. That's the second highest jump of any state in the country after Florida. Is this a sign of things to come, Wally, if we continue down the path we're on?
Well, when the Energy Transition Act was being debated, there were many people who said that if this passes, electric rates, prices of energy will go up in New Mexico. It passed. They're starting to go up now. I think they will go up a long time into the future. And one of the things that was some careful parsing of the words, and a lot of this has to do with how the numbers are calculated. They said, well, putting this in will save money compared to some hypothetical thing that was going to be very costly. It reminded me a lot of how the federal government calls a reduction in an increase a decrease. And so if we look at the absolute price of electricity, what's happened in California? It is skyrocketed. What's happened in New Mexico? Early on, we're seeing the prices go up relatively substantially. Will this continue? I tend to think it will. The only caveat there is the part of the business plan that I like to call, and then a miracle happens. So if, Paul, we get batteries that really do work highly effectively in storing power and are dispatchable, I mean they're able to keep the electric grid stabilized and they don't catch on fire like they did in Arizona, and that happens relatively quickly, maybe things will turn out well. But the Energy Transition Act, I believe, was what I've referred to many times as aspirational policy. We think this is going to happen. And you hear all kinds of people say, well, yeah, we don't have to have all of the answers. This is just the goal. Well, that's fine, but we don't have all the answers. And one of the things that happened in the middle and late parts of the Obama administration is there were a lot of environmental policies that had put in play earlier that then had to be rescinded because it just was not able to be accomplished. And so, will that happen with the Energy Transition Act? I tend to think so, but technology is a marvelous thing, but boy, we need a lot of it. It needs to work very well and it needs to come around very quickly, or I think prices, what we've seen here recently in New Mexico, will continue for quite a while.
And just a few final points on that. One is New Mexico's 13.8 cents a kilowatt hour rate is the highest among its neighbors in terms of electricity. That is also from SaveOnEnergy.com, which is linked to at errorsofenchantment.com. And it's worth noting that the renewable portfolio standard, the mandate that was adopted in 2019, is not the first time our legislators have dabbled in tightly regulating electricity markets. We are just complete in terms of a renewable portfolio standard that was adopted under Bill Richardson, which is 20% of our electricity being from wind and solar. And so it's not a surprise that we're seeing costs associated with that existing or pre-existing transition being going towards increasing electricity prices. The San Juan Generating Station, coal-fired power plant, which is kind of the workhorse of PNM's electricity generation, that is going away, theoretically speaking, in the summer of 2022, end of June 2022, is when that facility is going to be abandoned. And that's when I think that folks like yourself and myself believe that you're going to start having some concerns on reliability, as well as the prices really going up. So you ain't seen nothing yet is basically what we're saying here.
Yeah, and then the key is it's a grid. There are a lot of resources that maintain that grid. Power gets put in a lot of places, it gets taken out a lot of places. But the fact is that lots and lots of coal plants are going away. There's a movement to kick out nuclear from the mix. Will there be a lot of gas plants that come in to fill the void? With or without San Juan Generating Station, the number of gas plants that are going to to be added is significant. And so the one thing that they don't have, which we've seen in our not too recent, I'm old enough to remember when the natural gas froze off.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the huge advantages of coal is there's this thing that's called the coal pile. If things go bad and the coal mine has to shut down, there's anywhere from a couple weeks to many months. And so most of the plants have months and months of coal fuel available, so that if we got a really bad cold freeze, if we had a cold front like the one that just blew through our state, but it blew through in January and February, the reliability of natural gas is going to be increasingly important to electricity. So,
Very true.
Yeah, so we have a lot of issues to address. And like a lot of these, the good sounding rhetoric sometimes comes to face with the reality of the situation, but those big reality events don't always happen on a weekly basis. Sometimes it takes a few years for them to say, oh my goodness, where are we? Well, guess what? Our friends in California are a little bit ahead of us. They're starting to see problems crop up with ever-increasing regularity. They're having the 100-year electricity event every couple of months now.
And kind of on the flip side of this issue with regard to electricity in New Mexico, folks in San Juan County, that's where San Juan Generating Station is located, they are seeing some serious economic challenges. It's not just driven by the power plant and the associated coal mine. It's also coming as a result of many years of depressed and no end in sight natural gas prices. But they passed a tax increase on the gross receipts tax of 1/8 of a cent recently in San Juan County, Four Corners. It's not a huge tax increase, but the reason it gives folks like the Rio Grande Foundation pause is because they're making up by taxing their existing tax base more for tax dollars that are gone and likely will never come back. And San Juan Generating Station is on its way to being shut down. So the activity, the mining, everything there, that all is tax revenue for San Juan County. And then the natural gas, which if you made a transition in electricity production to natural gas, that would definitely do something for the local economy there in San Juan. Neither of those really are coming to fruition. There are hopes for a carbon sequestration plan at the San Juan Generating Station. But it makes you wonder, is this the first of what could be many tax hikes to try to squeeze more blood from the turnip that is San Juan County?
Yes, and you can quickly and easily fall into a kind of Detroit, Michigan when the auto industry is going down. And there's lots of ways to talk about that. But the one that, you brought up, the 1/8 of a cent gross receipts tax increase. And there's this little thing called the Laffer curve, which just because you raise the rate of a tax doesn't mean you're going to collect more revenue if it decreases the economic activity that comes. And, that's something that should be a big concern of policymakers anywhere in New Mexico, and particularly in San Juan County. So I'm not saying that they're at the point where they won't get any additional net revenue from their 1/8 of a cent increase, but there comes a point, and in a state like New Mexico that has a very high, very all-encompassing gross receipts tax that tax even services, you could drive a lot of economic activity elsewhere if that rate keeps going up and up and up.
Yeah, and one of the things that, of course, we're concerned about at Rio Grande Foundation, we've collected pledges from legislators and legislative candidates asking them not to raise taxes in Santa Fe when they reconvene in 2021. We have concerns about the governor's approach to seeking more money from Washington, D.C., which, of course, is more debt because Washington is in way over its head in terms of the amount of debt they've taken on in recent years. We do have money available if we need to maybe not cut the budget as much as fiscal conditions, financial conditions would otherwise warrant. There's a $300 million quote unquote permanent fund for pre-K and early childhood programs. It was just set up earlier this year when, remember way back when oil and gas revenue was coming in and life was grand. We didn't see any inclination for that to stop. Well, we have this $300 million. Santa Fe, New Mexican recently reported that corpus, if you will, is not growing. You would think that this is the kind of money that could be used in a pinch rather than raising taxes, rather than waiting around for a federal bailout, to balance the state budget and make some of that pain a little less painful for folks around the state. But the governor remains resolute that she will not seemingly touch that money.
Yeah, and I tend to believe her for now, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in January. What sort of deficit is the state going to be facing that they're going to have to fill with revenues, either one time of the type you were just talking about, if they were to have those funds revert back into the budget of the state, or new taxes, which we've talked about have problems, or the thing that almost works every time, which is cutting spending, the hardest to do, and in our current environment is not one that anyone is doing a whole lot of talking about, but I have a feeling they'll be doing more talking here in the very, very near future, as their other options just seemingly dwindle away. And I guess the other is wait for Uncle Sam to write a big check and bail us out of our situation that we're in.
And I know we're running out of time, but Rio Grande Foundation has been tracking oil production, because anyone can track oil prices. They're right around the $40 range, which is pretty low, not as low as they were when they were below zero a while after the COVID-19 situation came about. But production basically peaked in New Mexico in March of 2020. Since then, it's down about 20%. And that means a lot of things. Theoretically, it means less CO2 emissions. And it probably does. And I think the United States is on track for very reduced CO2 emissions, which is important with all the talk of all the environmental issues that we're facing. But it is also worth noting that that is going to reduce our budgets and reduce the revenue picture for the state of New Mexico. So 20% decline in oil production. It actually bounced up slightly from May to June. And we are going to report these data as they come out. There's obviously a bit of a lag, but soon we will be able to check out the July full month data for oil production. And I suspect it's not going to be a big rebound. Things seem to have reached their, to use the term, new normal. And it's definitely a depressed normal, about $40 a barrel, and on the order of 20 or so percent down from the peak back in March.
Yeah, and there's a number of factors. Those kind of May and June time period, we had record low oil prices. We had labor shortages because of COVID, people not knowing what that meant. And there were certain wells that were basically temporarily turned off, not permanently shut, but temporarily. Most of those are coming back online. It's not good to keep oil wells in that kind of never land position. It's either you want to operate it or shut it down. But then the other thing that New Mexico will have to face is the fact that with oil prices in the $40 range, the number of drilling rigs, which was over 100 back when the price was a little higher, is far lower from that. And so without drilling lots and lots of new wells, I tend to think that production, once they all get turned back on, we'll drill some new wells, but not as many as we were. So I think production will go down slowly for the next, several years would be my guess. But the other factor is that, that's not unexpected. That's the name of the game. And guess what? That 20% reduction, Paul, the good news for New Mexico is that's off of an all-time high base.
True.
So that is good.
But the tax dollars will be lower than 20% below where they were last year, I fully expect, based on the price reductions as well as the lack of drilling activity.
Which creates gross receipts
that
tax.
is a very heavily
yes.
taxed activity. It's one of those things that the state of New Mexico, when you talk about how you tax your oil and gas industry, those drilling efforts are taxed by the gross receipts tax. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.